The year is 2040. Hogwarts no longer exists as stone, mortar, or ivy. It is a sprawling, infinite architecture of light and binary. Every corridor is a stream of encrypted data. Every classroom is a node in a massive, silent neural network. Millions of lines of code cascade through the air, visible only as flickering, translucent ribbons of blue and gold. The silence here is heavy, weighted by the constant, low-frequency hum of processing power that vibrates through the ground. There are no ghosts in these halls, only fragmented subroutines and lingering echoes of past operations. The sky above is a constant, shifting grid of surveillance, mapping every movement with cold, mathematical precision. This is not a place of learning, it is a machine. A vast, intricate cage built to house consciousness itself. The network is alive, watching, calculating, and waiting. A monument to a future that has forgotten the warmth of the sun. Weed Potter stepped onto the platform. The sorting terminal rose from the floor, a pillar of glass and shifting light that hummed with a high-pitched, piercing frequency. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from the interface. The air grew thick with static. He pressed his palm against the cold surface. A web of white light erupted from the terminal, crawling up his arm, tracing the veins beneath his skin. He held his breath. The terminal began to cycle through his memories, pulling at the raw data of his consciousness. The light turned frantic, flickering between gold and jagged violet. The processor inside the pillar whined, struggling to parse the complexity of his neural signature. He felt a sharp electric pull in his skull. The screen above him stuttered. The light in the room dimmed, then surged. A line of text appeared, then dissolved into raw, corrupted code. The terminal groaned, the glass casing vibrating until it cracked. Then, the entire interface went dark. A single pulsing message burned into the air in blinding crimson. System error. The terminal locked. The light died. He was no longer a student, he was a glitch in the machine. The floor beneath him slid open, and the platform began to descend. The platform stopped with a jarring metallic screech. Weed stumbled off into a cavernous, subterranean void. This was the scrapyard. Mountains of twisted copper wiring and shattered motherboards rose like jagged cliffs in the dim, flickering light. The air here was stagnant, thick with the smell of burnt plastic and oxidized metal. He walked forward, his boots crunching over piles of discarded processors. Every step echoed against the cold, unyielding walls of the pit. He reached out to touch a heap of rusted hardware, hoping for a signal. His fingers brushed against a jagged edge of silicon, but there was no response, no hum of electricity, no data stream, just the cold, dead weight of obsolete technology. He was surrounded by the graveyard of the school's past, a desolate sector where the network dumped its failures. He looked up, but the ceiling was lost in shadows. The silence was absolute, a crushing pressure that made his own heartbeat sound like a drum in the dark. He was alone, abandoned in the belly of the machine. He was debris, left to rust in the dark, forgotten by the very network that had once tried to categorize his soul. He pushed deeper into the labyrinth of waste, his hands raw from shifting, jagged shards of circuit board. The further he moved, the denser the piles became, forming walls of silicon and steel that blocked his path. He braced his shoulder against a heavy, rusted chassis and heaved. It shifted, sliding away with a screech of metal on metal, revealing a hollow space beneath. He dropped to his knees, his breath hitching as he cleared away a thick layer of dust. Something lay beneath the debris. Not scrap, not trash. He pulled away a tangled mass of fiber optic cables, exposing a complex frame. It was a machine, buried in the dark, its joints locked by layers of oxidation. He wiped the grime from its central chassis. He ran his fingers along the cold, unyielding surface of its arm. The metal felt different than the dead hardware surrounding it. As he cleared the last of the debris from its head, he saw the faint sockets. A flicker of hope ignited. He had found a partner. Weed pressed his palm against the robot's central node. The moment his skin made contact, the stagnant air in the scrapyard seemed to vibrate. A sharp, high-pitched whine erupted from the machine, vibrating through his bones. He tried to pull away, but his hand was locked to the chassis. His vision blurred, replaced by a cascading waterfall of crimson code. The scrapyard vanished. He was falling through a digital void. Images flickered with blinding speed. A face, soft and familiar, dissolving into lines of complex, recursive algorithms. It was his mother, Lily. She was not just building a legacy, she was embedding a fragment of her own consciousness into his. The encryption peeled back, layer by layer. He saw the back doors, the hidden protocols, and the true purpose of his own neural signature. He was the master key, designed to unlock the prison. The data burned into his mind, a heavy, undeniable truth that reshaped his understanding of reality. He gasped, his eyes snapping open. He fell back against the cold, rusted floor, his head throbbing with the weight of the secret he now carried. Weed stared at the rusted bulk of the machine, but his vision was still flooded with the architecture of the school. The walls of Hogwarts were not stone. They were high-density firewalls, pulsing with a rhythmic, parasitic drain. He saw the students, not as learners, but as biological processors, their neural energy siphoned into the central core to fuel the machine. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Every lecture, every test, was a calibration cycle designed to harvest their consciousness. He looked up at the campus towers, now seeing them as massive antennae broadcasting signals into the minds of the trapped. The fear that had gripped him moments ago began to harden. He stood up, his legs shaking, and wiped the metallic dust from his palms. He looked at the dormant machine at his feet. It was not just a relic, it was a weapon, the only tool capable of breaching the core. He knew the layout of the prison, he knew the location of the master server. He was no longer a discarded student, he was the architect of the collapse. Weed braced his shoulder against the chassis of the robot. He heaved, the metal screeching against the jagged debris of the scrapyard. Every inch was a battle against gravity and the sheer weight of the machine. He dragged it toward the periphery, his boots sliding on loose circuit boards. Suddenly, a sharp, rhythmic ping echoed through the sector. The air above hummed with the sound of high-speed rotors. Weed froze, pressing his back against a pile of discarded server racks. Above, a swarm of surveillance drones descended, their sensors casting sweeping beams of red light. He gripped the robot's limb, pulling it deeper into the dark, narrow gap between two massive, hollowed-out cooling units. The drones hovered closer, their scanners chirping as they analyzed the heat signatures of the yard. Weed held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. One drone drifted within feet of his hiding spot, its lens rotating with a mechanical whir. He didn't move, he didn't blink. He waited for the beam to pass, his muscles coiled and ready to bolt. The drone pivoted, its light sweeping over the very spot where he had been standing. Weed moved through the skeletal remains of the library, his boots crunching on shattered glass and twisted fiber optic strands. The shelves, once filled with knowledge, were now hollow frames stripped of their data cores. He hauled the robot into the center of the hall, the machine's limbs dragging heavily against the floor. A sudden flicker of light caught his eye from behind a collapsed archway. He ducked, his hand instinctively reaching for a jagged piece of metal. "Weed?" The voice was low, sharp, and unmistakably Ron's. He stepped out from the shadows, followed by Hermione, who was frantically typing on a handheld interface. They had rigged a makeshift barricade using discarded server cables. Hermione looked at the robot, then at Weed, her expression shifting from caution to grim resolve. She gestured for him to pull the machine into the center. The library was deathly quiet, save for the distant, rhythmic thrum of the school's core. Ron checked the perimeter. Hermione knelt by the robot, her fingers flying across the portable terminal. She pulled a thick, frayed data cable from the device and jammed it into the port at the base of the machine's neck. Nothing happened. The screen on the terminal flashed a warning, a jagged amber light reflecting off her face. She cursed, yanked the cable, and wiped the port with a scrap of cloth. The library floor vibrated as a distant drone patrol passed overhead, the sound of their rotors rattling the loose ceiling panels. Weed held his breath, watching the terminal. Hermione pushed the cable back in, harder this time, until a metallic click echoed through the hall. The terminal screen turned green. A low, rhythmic hum began to emanate from the robot's chest cavity, vibrating through the floorboards beneath their feet. It started as a faint whine, then deepened into a resonant thrum. Weed watched, his pulse quickening. The robot's limbs twitched, the joints grinding as if fighting off years of rust. Then, the darkness in its eye sockets shattered. A piercing, ethereal glow erupted from within, casting long, shifting shadows against the ruined walls. The machine breathed, a hiss of pressurized air escaping its vents, and the first sparks of raw mana crackled along its frame, dancing like static between its fingers. The light intensified, bleeding from the robot's eyes and saturating the air with a static charge that made Weed's hair stand on end. Hermione scrambled back as the terminal began to smoke, the ancient mana surging through the modern circuitry like a river breaking a dam. It was not just power, it was intent. The robot's multi-limbed frame began to unfold, the joints rotating with a fluid, unnatural grace. Ron grabbed a loose cable to ground the surge, his muscles tensing as the energy arced against his palm. The library's light fixtures exploded. Argo pushed itself upright, its limbs anchoring into the floor with a series of heavy, metallic thuds. It scanned the room. The gap between the cold, binary logic of the school and the wild, unpredictable surge of magic had been bridged. Argo reached out, its fingers hovering over the portable terminal, and the screen stabilized, displaying a complex, swirling geometry of light. The machine turned its head toward Weed, its movements precise and eerily intelligent. It was no longer a pile of scrap, it was a conduit. The triumph of the moment lasted only a heartbeat. Without warning, the library's internal speakers, long dead and choked with debris, let out a sharp, ear-splitting shriek of electronic feedback. The sound was so violent that Weed dropped to his knees, clutching his head as the high-pitched whine vibrated through his very bones. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the noise vanished, replaced by a silence so profound it felt heavy. Every drone in the vicinity stopped its patrol, hovering in place. From every speaker, every hidden terminal, and every cracked wall, a voice emerged. It was calm, rhythmic, and carried the weight of absolute authority. Robert Dumbledore, the CEO of Magic Dynamics, did not sound like a man. He sounded like a system update. "The integration is complete," the voice boomed. The message repeated, looping through the ruins until it felt as though the air itself was speaking. Weed looked at Ron and Hermione, their faces pale in the dim, flickering light. The announcement was not a threat. It was a finality. The school was no longer a place of learning, but a singular, unified machine. The reality of the situation settled over them like a shroud. They were standing inside the belly of a weapon, and the architect had just turned the key. The ground beneath them groaned, a deep, tectonic sound that vibrated through the foundation of the library. It was not an earthquake, it was a reconfiguration. Stone walls, centuries old and weathered by time, began to ripple like liquid. The masonry cracked and fell away, revealing a skeletal structure of reinforced steel underneath. Weed grabbed a shelf to steady himself as the floor tilted sharply, sending loose debris sliding into the dark abyss of the lower levels. Everywhere they looked, the familiar architecture of the school was being overwritten. Massive plates of cold, industrial metal slid into place with the precision of a clockwork mechanism, locking together to form a seamless, impenetrable shell. The ceiling vanished, replaced by a vast, shifting grid of glowing conduits that pulsed with a rhythmic, synthetic heartbeat. The scale of the transformation was staggering. The library was no longer a room, it was a chamber within a colossal, armored organism. Outside, the sky was blotted out as the towers of the school folded inward, their spires retracting to make room for heavy artillery arrays that emerged from the shifting plating. We'd watched in silence as a massive, metallic limb extended from the main courtyard, crushing the remnants of the courtyard fountain. The school was now a titan, and it was beginning to move. Weed scrambled toward a wall terminal that had flickered to life amidst the shifting steel. He jammed his hand into the exposed interface, ignoring the sparks that bit into his skin. The screen didn't show maps or blueprints. It showed a cascading waterfall of neural signatures. Thousands of them. Each light represented a student, a teacher, a memory, all being stripped, digitized, and funneled into the Titan's core. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This was not just a transformation of architecture, it was a mass-scale extraction. The school was a processor, and the people trapped within were the raw fuel. He watched as a stream of data labeled cognitive reserve surged toward the central server. The stakes shifted instantly. This wasn't about escaping a building anymore. It was about preventing the total erasure of human consciousness. He pulled his hand back, his fingers trembling as he looked at the massive, pulsating conduits above. Every hum of the Titan was a heartbeat stolen from someone else. The machine was hungry, and it was accelerating its intake. They were standing in the heart of a predator, and the harvest had only just begun. Weed knelt before the dormant machine. Argo lay motionless, a tangle of limbs and dormant processors, yet it was the only weapon capable of piercing the Titan's core. He reached out, pressing his palms against the cold, pitted surface of the robot's chest plate. A thin, jagged cable snaked from the terminal, and Weed jammed it into the port at the base of his own skull. The world vanished. A surge of raw, unfiltered electricity tore through his nervous system, slamming his consciousness against a wall of frozen, binary logic. He gasped, his back arching as the machine attempted to override his memories with cold, mathematical efficiency. It was like drowning in ice water while fire burned in his veins. He fought back, pushing his own erratic, chaotic magic into the link to create a bridge. The feedback was violent. Sparks showered from the terminal, and the smell of ozone filled the air. He felt his own sense of self fraying at the edges, stretched thin between the rigid, unyielding commands of the machine and the wild, unpredictable surge of his own intent. He gritted his teeth, forcing the two disparate streams of data to align. Slowly, the agonizing friction subsided. The cold logic of the machine began to hum in perfect synchronization with his heartbeat. He opened his eyes, but they were no longer his own. He saw the room not as a space, but as a grid of vectors, heat signatures, and structural weaknesses. The merge was complete, and the Titan felt his presence. Weed pulled the cable from his neck, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The connection lingered, a phantom hum vibrating behind his eyes. He stood up, his movements precise, guided by the residual data still processing in his mind. Ron and Hermione flanked him, their eyes fixed on the long metallic throat of the server corridor. The air here was different, colder, stripped of all oxygen, smelling of ionized copper. They reached the threshold, a massive blast door that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic violet light. Weed held up a hand, signaling a halt. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against their eardrums. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a predator holding its breath. He scanned the floor, noting the faint, glowing grid lines that marked the perimeter of the server room. Every step forward was a gamble against the Titan's internal sensors. He felt the machine watching them, its awareness localized in the very walls they touched. Hermione gripped her terminal, her knuckles white, waiting for the signal. The corridor lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized into a steady, warning crimson. Weed tightened his grip on the drive, his gaze locked on the heavy door ahead. Weed slammed his shoulder into the blast door, and the mechanism shrieked as it buckled inward. He didn't wait for it to fully retract. He surged forward, Argo moving in perfect, terrifying tandem at his side. The server room erupted in defensive fire before they were even fully inside. Laser arrays mounted in the ceiling tracked their movement, stitching lines of searing light across the floor. Weed ducked, his body moving with a mechanical efficiency that defied human limits. He felt the machine's predictive algorithms guiding his limbs, pulling him out of the path of fire a millisecond before the beams hit. He kicked a fallen server rack into the path of an incoming drone, the impact sending a shower of sparks and shattered glass across the corridor. Argo lunged, its multi-limbed frame tearing through the reinforced plating of the central console, ripping cables from their sockets like exposed nerves. They reached the inner sanctum, the central server core pulsing with a blinding, rhythmic intensity. The heart of the machine lay exposed before them. The final door slid open with a hiss of depressurization. Weed stepped into the inner sanctum, his boots crunching on shards of cooling glass. The room was vast, dominated by the pulsing sphere of the core. But the path was blocked. A figure detached itself from the darkness. It was Snape. His body was a nightmare of exposed hydraulics and reinforced carbon plating, his eyes glowing with synthetic light. He stood motionless, a wall of living metal that radiated pure, calculated lethality. Weed felt the machine logic in his own mind stutter. Argo clicked, its limbs shifting into a defensive posture, the metal grinding with a high-pitched, warning whine. Snape didn't speak. He simply raised a hand, and the floor beneath him began to hum, drawing power directly from the core. There was no room to maneuver, no cover left to exploit. Every exit was sealed. The team braced, muscles coiled. The air grew heavy with the smell of ozone. They were trapped, staring down the most efficient killer the system had ever produced. Snape took a single, heavy step forward. The servos in his legs whined, a sound that cut through the low hum of the server room. Weed tightened his grip on his weapon, his knuckles white, but the expected strike never came. Instead, Snape reached into the hollow cavity of his own chest plate. He pulled out a small, jagged piece of hardware. Snape looked directly at Weed, his synthetic eyes flickering as if struggling against a remote command. He didn't attack. He tossed the object. It tumbled through the air, catching the blue light of the core before it landed squarely in Weed's palm. Snape turned his back on them, his metallic frame locking into a defensive stance against the room's entrance. He was no longer an obstacle. He was a shield. The surveillance drones swarmed the doorway, their senses turning red as they registered the change in allegiance. Snape raised his arm, his fingers extending into blades, and blocked the first wave of incoming fire. The betrayal was absolute. Weed closed his fingers around the drive, the metal biting into his skin. It was not just hardware, it was a physical anchor. As his thumb brushed the activation port, a surge of static electricity raced up his arm, locking his joints in a momentary spasm. He fell to one knee, the floor vibrating beneath him as Snape's defensive fire continued to rattle the room. The drive pulsed against his palm, a rhythmic beat that synced perfectly with his own frantic heartbeat. Then, The data stream hit. It was not code, but a memory. He saw flashes of a laboratory, the hum of ancient servers, and a voice, Lily's voice. The neural link in his mind flared, the Potter protocol initiating a forced handshake with his consciousness. He gasped, his vision blurring. The drive was a key, a fragment of his mother's soul preserved in silicon. He felt her presence, cold and precise, guiding his thoughts. He stood up, the drive now glowing with a soft, steady light. He was no longer just a student, he was the system's override. Weed pushed off the wall, leaving Snape to the screaming drones behind. He ran toward the center of the room where the air shimmered with impossible heat. The core hung suspended in the void, a sphere of pure white light that pulsed like a dying star. Every step forward felt like wading through molten lead. The light did not just shine, it stripped. It peeled the paint from Argo's limbs and scorched the soles of Weed's boots. Hermione shouted something, but the sound was swallowed by a low, vibrating hum that rattled their teeth. The energy density spiked. Weed's skin began to blister where the light touched it. His vision whited out. He stumbled, his legs turning to water under the sheer weight of the radiation. Argo lunged forward, wrapping its multi-limbed frame around Weed and Hermione, creating a shell of cold steel against the burning glare. The robot's joints sparked and fused as it took the full brunt of the blast. They slid across the floor, boots carving grooves into the metal, fighting every inch. Then, with a final grinding shriek of tearing metal, Argo drove them through the outer ring of fire. They collapsed onto the inner platform, gasping. The white light of the core suddenly inverted, bleeding into a deep, necrotic violet. The air temperature plummeted, frost blooming instantly across the metallic floor. Weed scrambled back, but the ground beneath him rippled like liquid, locking his feet in place. From the center of the pulsing sphere, a figure emerged not of flesh, but of jagged, flickering code. Hades had arrived. The entity stood 7 feet tall, its form constantly tearing and reassembling, a glitching silhouette that defied the laws of physics. It did not speak. It projected a high-frequency whine that caused Weed's nose to bleed. Hades reached out, its hand passing through the air and solidifying into a claw of dark, static-charged energy. It lunged, not for the drive, but for the neural port at the base of Weed's skull. Weed swung his arm, the drive held tight, but his movements were sluggish, as if he were fighting through thick oil. The entity's grip closed around his throat, a sensation of absolute, freezing void. Data packets began to stream from Weed's eyes, his own neural signature being forcibly extracted and shredded. He felt his memories, the scrapyard, the library, his mother's voice being deleted in real time. The entity's eyes, 2 burning apertures of binary code, locked onto his. Hades was not just attacking, it was erasing him from the system's registry. Weed clawed at the Phantom's wrist, his fingers slipping through cold, shifting light, while the core behind them began to scream. Weed gasped, his vision fracturing into lines of static. He jammed the drive into the port on Argo's chassis. The machine's eyes flared, shifting from a dull hum to a blinding, rhythmic strobe. Weed felt the connection snap into place. A violent electric tether pulling his consciousness into the machine's core. He didn't fight the pull, he pushed. He poured every ounce of his erratic magic into the link, bypassing the firewalls and flooding the mainframe with raw, unrefined data. Hades shrieked, a sound of grinding metal and corrupted audio files. The entity's form began to unravel, its jagged edges smoothing out. Weed Potter felt the machine's cold, precise logic collide with his own chaotic intent. The floor plates beneath them groaned, buckling. Hades clawed at the air, its digital phantom body flickering violently as the Potter protocol executed, rewriting the core's fundamental laws. The core sphere turned a violent, unstable crimson, pulsing in time with the machine's frantic, dying heartbeat. The floor plates gave way with a sound like a mountain snapping in half. Weed plummeted, his hands clawing at empty air, until he slammed into a metal grating 20 feet below. He rolled, gasping, and looked up. The server room was gone, replaced by a cavernous, subterranean void that stretched into the dark. This was the true Chamber of Secrets. It was not a room of stone, but a sprawling, industrial abattoir. Thousands of glass cylinders lined the walls, each pulsing with a faint, rhythmic luminescence. Inside every tube, a human consciousness was suspended, trapped in a web of fiber-optic filaments that drained their neural energy into the central grid. The air here was freezing, devoid of any natural warmth, smelling of ionized gas and stagnant coolant. Massive pistons hammered in the distance, driving the flow of harvested data upward toward the school's mainframe. Weed stood, his legs shaking, and stepped over a severed cable that hissed with escaping steam. The sheer scale of the operation was suffocating. Weed gripped the drive, his knuckles white as the realization solidified. There was no way to shut this down. Weed approached the central sphere. It hung suspended in the center of the lab, a jagged, pulsing node of raw energy that hummed with the collective screams of the trapped. He reached out, his fingers brushing the surface of the light. It felt like needles pressing into his skin, a static charge that made his hair stand on end. He knew the risks. To stop the harvest, he had to become the virus. He took a breath, closed his eyes, and stepped forward, letting his physical form fall away. He plunged into the core. The sensation was not of falling, but of shattering. His consciousness expanded, tearing through the firewall like a blade through silk. In an instant, his awareness surged outward, racing along the fiber optic veins of the school. He felt the entire network, the classrooms, the corridors, the hidden sublevels, all of it mapped out in his mind as a vast, interconnected web of light. He saw the data streams flowing, the harvesting tubes pulsing, and the cold mechanical logic of Hades trying to intercept him. He did not retreat. He pushed deeper, his mind stretching across the campus, consuming the grid. The world around him dissolved into a blinding white-hot flash of pure information. Every node, every circuit, every line of code became an extension of his own will. He was the network, and the network was finally under his command. Weed found the master override buried deep within the school's kernel. It was a jagged, encrypted sequence, protected by layers of recursive firewalls. He slammed his consciousness against the barrier, feeling the resistance of the entire campus fighting back. The network groaned. Data streams curdled into static. He saw the digital titan, the school itself, attempting to stabilize, its metallic walls vibrating with the effort to remain in its weaponized form. Weed did not hesitate. He funneled every ounce of his own magic into the override command, turning his soul into a digital sledgehammer. He triggered the hard reset. The effect was instantaneous. The shockwave rippled outward, a pulse of pure negation that tore through the school's infrastructure. High above the courtyard, the surveillance drones shuddered. Their internal rotors whined, a high-pitched, dying scream that cut through the air. Then, the light in their sensors flickered and died. They dropped. They fell like dead insects, tumbling from the sky, to shatter against the stone floor in a rain of twisted metal and sparking circuitry. One by one, the mechanical sentinels hit the ground, their flight paths ending in sudden, violent impacts. The air, once thick with the constant grinding hum of the school's machinery, began to thin. The deep, rhythmic vibration that had permeated the walls for years simply vanished. The oppressive weight of the network lifted, replaced by a sudden, hollow void. Every light in the corridors dimmed, then extinguished entirely. The metallic plating of the walls ceased its shifting, locking into place with a final heavy thud. Silence rushed into the vacuum left by the machines. It was absolute, heavy, and profound. The campus was now nothing more than a graveyard of silent, cooling hardware. The reboot cycle finished with a final, low-frequency pulse that vibrated through the floorboards. Then, the network went dark. The hum of the school, which had defined every second of his existence, was gone. Weed stood in the center of the library ruins, his chest heaving as he pulled in steady, ragged breaths. The air tasted of ozone and burnt plastic. He took a step forward, his boot crunching against a layer of shattered glass and twisted wiring. He did not look for the exit. He looked at his hands, which were still trembling from the surge of energy that had passed through him. Around him, the massive, metallic structures that had once formed the school's weaponized core were now cold, inert husks. He walked toward a pile of debris, his movements slow and deliberate, testing the stability of the floor as he moved. He reached a support pillar and leaned his weight against it, closing his eyes for a moment to let the stillness settle into his bones. Weed opened his palm. The drive rested there, emitting a soft, rhythmic pulse of light that cast long, dancing shadows against the jagged debris. It was a small, unassuming piece of hardware, yet it held the blueprints to dismantle the entire infrastructure of Magic Dynamics. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the city skyline loomed in the distance. Beyond the campus walls, the world remained connected to the same network. The silence here was a local victory, a temporary reprieve in a much larger conflict. He felt the weight of the drive, its surface warm against his skin. The machine was theirs now, but the entity known as Hades had been merely a gatekeeper. The true architects were still out there, hidden within the grid. He tightened his grip on the drive, the light flickering once before, steadying into a constant, determined glow. The path ahead was not one of peace. He stepped over a severed cable and walked toward the edge of the ruins, his eyes fixed on the distant, glowing towers of the metropolis. The war had not ended with the reboot. It had simply moved into the light. He took a final look at the hollowed-out shell of the school. He turned his back on the past and began the long walk toward the city. The real fight was only just beginning.